On December 9, 2017, the government of Sri Lanka signed over a port, not a small harbour, a deep water port on the southern tip of the island, one of the most strategically positioned pieces of real estate in the Indian Ocean. The port of Hambantota, which Sri Lanka had spent over $1 billion building with Chinese loans it could no longer repay, was handed to a Chinese state-owned company on a 99-year lease. In exchange, China cancelled a fraction of the debt. The rest remained. Sri Lanka still owed it. And China now controlled a port that sits directly on the shipping lane that carries 40% of the world's container traffic and 80% of global oil trade. It was not a military invasion. There were no soldiers, no warships, no threats. It was alone. And this is how the world's most powerful silent weapon works.
In 2013, Chinese President Xi Jinping announced what would become the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history.
The Belt and Road Initiative, originally called One Belt, One Road, was presented to the world as a development program. China would lend money to developing nations across Asia, Africa, the Middle East and Latin America to build the infrastructure those countries desperately needed. Roads, railways, ports, power plants, fiber optic cables, pipelines. China would supply the financing, the engineers, the construction firms and the materials. The borrowing nations would get the infrastructure. Everyone would benefit. By 2023, the Belt and Road Initiative had extended to over 150 countries. It had committed over $1 trillion in financing. It had funded thousands of infrastructure projects across 6 continents. It had, in the space of a decade, made China the largest bilateral creditor nation in the world, surpassing the United States, Japan and the World Bank combined in terms of lending to developing nations. And embedded inside every one of those loans was something the borrowing governments often did not fully understand when they signed. The Belt and Road debt trap does not work the way a predatory loan from a private bank works. It is more sophisticated than that, and it is more patient. Here is the pattern. China's state-owned banks, primarily the Export-Import Bank of China and the China Development Bank, offer loans at interest rates that appear competitive, 3 to 6% typically. Repayment terms of 15 to 20 years, no political conditions attached. No requirements to hold elections, privatize state industries, or implement austerity measures of the kind the IMF typically demands. For governments in the developing world that have spent decades being lectured by Western institutions about governance and reform, China's offer is framed as something simple. We will lend you the money, you build what you need, and we ask nothing except repayment. But buried in the contracts are clauses that almost never become public. Academic researchers at AidData, who spent years analyzing over 100 Belt and Road loan contracts, found systematic patterns. Chinese state banks required borrowers to maintain cash collateral accounts, reserve funds held in Chinese banks that Beijing could seize in the event of default. They included cross-default clauses, meaning that defaulting on one Chinese loan could trigger acceleration of all Chinese loans simultaneously. They prohibited borrowing governments from disclosing the terms of the contracts to other creditors, to the IMF, or to their own citizens. And they included provisions that, in the event of a dispute, required arbitration not in the borrowing country's courts, but in Chinese courts under Chinese law. The loans were also structured around a problem the borrowing nations often did not see coming. The infrastructure projects funded by Chinese loans almost always required Chinese construction firms, Chinese engineers, and Chinese-sourced materials. The money never left China. It was loaned to Sri Lanka and immediately paid to Chinese contractors who built the port. Sri Lanka received the infrastructure but not the economic activity that should have accompanied it, the jobs, the supply chains, the technology transfer. What Sri Lanka received was the debt. The case of Hambantota is the one that made the debt trap famous, but it is not the exception. It is the pattern. In Zambia, China became the dominant creditor through a series of loans for power infrastructure, road construction, and telecommunications. By 2020, Zambia had defaulted on its Chinese debt. Negotiations over restructuring dragged for years, in part because China refused to participate in coordinated restructuring frameworks with other creditors, insisting on bilateral arrangements that left other lenders and Zambia in limbo. The assets underpinning the loans included the national electricity grid and Kenneth Kaunda International Airport. In Kenya, a Chinese-financed railway connecting Mombasa to Nairobi, the Standard Gauge Railway, was built at a cost of approximately $5 billion, almost entirely funded by Chinese loans and constructed by Chinese firms. By 2018, debt servicing on the railway consumed more than a third of Kenya's total transport revenue. The railway itself operated at a loss. Internal Kenyan government documents revealed that the loan contract gave the Export-Import Bank of China rights over Mombasa port's revenue in the event of default. Kenya's most strategically critical port, its main gateway to the global economy, was collateral for a Chinese loan. In Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a $62 billion network of infrastructure projects connecting China's Xinjiang province to Pakistan's Gwadar port on the Arabian Sea, has become the single largest driver of Pakistan's external debt crisis. The energy projects funded under this corridor charge rates that Pakistani consumers and industries cannot sustain. Repatriation clauses in the contracts guarantee Chinese investors returns denominated in dollars, creating a permanent drain on Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves. And Gwadar Port, a deep-water facility on the Arabian Sea with direct access to the Persian Gulf, is operated by a Chinese state company on a 43-year concession. It would be a mistake to think of Belt and Road purely as a financial scheme. The financial mechanics are real, but they are the mechanism, not the purpose. What China acquires through the debt trap is something no military expenditure can buy directly, strategic positioning disguised as commerce. Hambantota puts Chinese infrastructure 900 kilometers from India's southern coast, directly on the Indian Ocean shipping lane. Gwadar gives China a port on the Arabian Sea, cutting thousands of miles off the route between Chinese factories and Middle Eastern oil. Chinese-financed ports and facilities in Djibouti, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Tanzania form what Indian and American strategists call the String of Pearls, a network of Chinese-influenced facilities encircling the Indian subcontinent and controlling access to critical sea lanes. Beyond geography, China acquires raw materials. Belt and Road loans to the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, and Zimbabwe are secured against cobalt, copper, and lithium reserves, the minerals that power the electric vehicle revolution that China intends to dominate. Loans to Ecuador and Venezuela were secured against oil. Loans to African agricultural nations have been settled in some cases through long-term agricultural land concessions. China does not need to colonize territory in the traditional sense. It lends money, waits for the default that the loan structure makes almost inevitable, and receives in exchange the asset that the loan was always designed to secure. The Western response to the Belt and Road Initiative has been a study in institutional failure. The United States, the European Union, Japan, and the multilateral development banks all recognized what was happening. They described it publicly, they issued warnings, and they were largely unable to offer a credible alternative. The fundamental problem is structural. The World Bank and the IMF attach conditions to their loans, governance requirements, transparency standards, macroeconomic conditions that many developing governments find politically impossible to meet domestically. China attaches no such conditions. A government that wants a port built quickly, without an election year debate about privatization policy, will take China's loan. The speed and simplicity of Chinese financing is not accidental, it is the product. Western counter-initiatives, the United States' Build Back Better World, the European Union's Global Gateway, Japan's Quality Infrastructure Initiative, have been announced with considerable fanfare and have moved with considerably less urgency. By the time Western institutions began offering genuine alternatives, China had already locked in relationships across dozens of countries through contracts that prohibit governments from discussing their terms with competing creditors. What the Belt and Road debt trap reveals is a theory of geopolitical power that the 20th century never fully developed. Traditional great power competition was about military force, nuclear arsenals, alliance structures, and ideological contests. China's version is different. It is slower, quieter, and potentially more durable. A military occupation ends when the occupier withdraws. A 99-year port lease does not. A military alliance requires constant political maintenance. A loan contract with cross-default clauses and collateral provisions is self-enforcing. The debt trap does not require China to threaten anyone. It does not require sanctions, warships, or diplomatic pressure. It requires only patience and capital, two things China has in extraordinary abundance. The question that Western strategists have not yet answered satisfactorily is this. When the instrument of geopolitical power is a loan contract, what is the appropriate counter-instrument? Military deterrence does not apply. Sanctions against the lender harm the borrower. And the borrowing nations, the ones that signed the contracts, are not adversaries. Many of them are formal allies of the United States. The Belt and Road Initiative will not be reversed through pressure on Beijing. It will be reversed, if it is reversed at all, through patient, serious, adequately funded alternatives that developing nations actually want to use. And as of today, those alternatives do not yet exist at the scale required. Which means the most powerful silent weapon in the world is still operating, and the contracts are still being signed. There is one final detail worth sitting with. When Sri Lanka handed over Hambantota on that 99-year lease, the country that received it did not celebrate publicly. There were no parades, no press conferences, no declarations of strategic victory. Beijing simply took delivery of a port, quietly, legally, through a contract that Sri Lanka signed willingly because it needed the money and because no one else was offering it on those terms. That is what makes this weapon different from everything that came before it. The target never sees it as an attack, they see it as a loan, and by the time they understand what they have given away, the lease has already been signed.